Hi, this is Mark Coopersmith of UC Berkeley, and I'm here with Rich Lyons, also of UC Berkeley, to talk about innovation and entrepreneurship on the campus and beyond. Rich, thanks for spending some time with me, with all of us today.
Happy to, thanks.
So, Rich, you're the Chief Innovation and Entrepreneurship Officer at UC Berkeley. You help provide this environment, this ecosystem in which great innovation and entrepreneurship can be developed, can be commercialized, can be shared, collaboration, all of those different elements. You've also spent a huge amount of time, as have I, right? We've both spent a lot of time at UC Berkeley as a student, as a professor, as
Yep.
dean of the Haas School of Business, and now in this current role, and some time in the private sector as well. Can you just share a little bit of that progression and kind of how it's brought you to this current role and those responsibilities you have, and perhaps some of your vision for what you want to accomplish?
Well, Mark, I understood there would be no personal questions on this call, so it's fine that we start here. But I will go. So undergrad, I was an undergrad here, and so I'll start at a very personal level. Neither of my parents had a four-year degree. I was at Berkeley. I've got two older brothers. I was a business major. I wanted to go into business. That's what I was going to do, and I had clarity on that. In my sophomore year, I wrote a midterm exam for a macroeconomics class, and a professor came up to me because I'd never talked to her in her office hours and said, "Come to my office hours." And one of the questions she asked me is, "Have you ever given any thought to the idea of getting a PhD in economics?" And literally, I don't think I knew anybody with a PhD in economics other than the faculty that I'd been meeting and so forth. Anyways, long story short, she helped scaffold me into thinking about that and made opportunities for me. And I did get a PhD in economics. I went from undergraduate business to an academic role, economics faculty member, came back to Berkeley in 1993 as a faculty member. And then, as Mark mentioned, served as dean of the business school at Haas. And I'm now in this new role at Berkeley. And so, you never know serendipitously how these things build up upon one another and parlay into new things and open doors you could never have imagined opening. But I think to sum it all up is the phrase that I just love so much: you can't be what you can't see. And there are just so many things when we're young, and even when when we get a little older, that we can't see in ourselves. And there are people around you that help you see those things, and all of a sudden those doorways and avenues open. And Berkeley, at so many, I didn't see myself as dean of a business school for the longest time, and Berkeley helped me to see that, and the people at Berkeley did. So that's sort of the through line in all of this.
Well, sometimes as we take a look at our lives, we can't always, it's kind of like a maze. We can't always figure out at the beginning how to get to the end.
Yep.
But as we're partway through and we look back, the pieces all fit together. So with that as a springboard, how does that influence the way that you think about your current role, which is a really different role than being the dean of the business school? Your current role helping collaborate, define, drive this environment, this the entrepreneurial ecosystem that we have, an innovation ecosystem that we have at Berkeley.
Yeah, well, one of the fascinating things, we put together an ecosystem time lapse. Every university has a graphical representation of their innovation and entrepreneurship ecosystem, but we never created a time lapse. So basically, what did it look like in the year 2000? How about 2005, 2010, 2015, 2020? And the delta is extraordinary. I think this would be true at a lot of universities, but boy, the delta is extraordinary. And I was here that whole time, so you'd think I would know what's going on, and it astonished me to look at that delta. And I think this new role, so my role didn't exist in 2019. It was started in January 2020, not just for me, but for the campus. And I think the idea was, is it time to put a dose of intentionality? Not top-down control. Berkeley doesn't work very well with top-down control, but a little bit more intentionality and coordination around how this remarkable ecosystem is evolving. And that was the genesis of the job description, and I threw my hat in, and of course I'm in the role now, and it's super exciting. I guess the only added point I would put to that is, because the job didn't exist before, we get to create it as we go along, which makes it, for me, even more fun, because you can kind of go for the stuff that looks like it could be really valuable.
Yeah. Who was it? I think it was Colin Powell who said management is going from one place to another, and leading your team. Leadership is going from one place to a place you don't know where you're going. And in a new role, you have that opportunity to help define the future.
Oh, well, I love that frame. Another one, I think it was Warren Bennis, but very much related, is this idea that managers do things right. Leaders do the right thing.
You're right.
It's about
Exactly.
what gets chosen to do that sort of defines, in its essence, leadership. Yeah.
So as we think about innovation and entrepreneurship at UC Berkeley, right, where we are here and also close proximity in the middle of Silicon Valley, we'll talk about that in a minute. What's the current state? There's so much activity going on. How would you define when somebody says to you, Rich, tell us what's going on when it comes to innovation and entrepreneurship at Berkeley? Where do you start, or how do you define that?
Well, I mean, that's an important and difficult question because it is so multifaceted. And again, I've been on the Berkeley campus for a long time, and I'm still seeing parts of it that I thought, wow, that is really deep and interesting, and I knew nothing about that 3 months ago. The whole licensing world and disclosures and getting patents and that stuff is still relatively new to me, and it is fascinating. I think so. For students, for example, when they ask me a question like this, I say, look, there's a clear answer. We spent at a campus a lot of resources to build a website, which is an encompassing portal. It's called Begin at Berkeley. When people say, how do I sort of navigate all those things? It's sort of like, go to Begin at Berkeley. It's the perfect place to get started on this. It doesn't mean you will learn everything on one website, but if you have to do one thing, that's the one thing you should do.
Right, and I'll be sure and include that URL at the end of this video as well.
Very good. And then, but just to give one other example, I mean, so my boss is Randy Katz, who's I'm a direct report of the Vice Chancellor for Research. That's kind of where I live in the organization. And I just had my annual review, and I submitted like 7 or 8 priorities. I said, these are the things I want to work on. He said, great. And these are the 3 of those 7 or 8 I really want you to work on. And one of them, to use it as an example, was we have these enormous assets around the life sciences, right? We've got CRISPR technology, gene editing, Jennifer Doudna, all the bioengineers, all this stuff that's going on. We have the IGI, Integrative Genomics Institute. We've got QB3, quantitative biology. We have the Baker Bioingenuity Hub that's opening. We have the new business and biology dual degree at the undergraduates. We just got a gift for a new bio-entrepreneurship center. His point was basically, we need to knit this stuff together and make sure that people aren't stepping on each other's toes. What does synergy look like? What does more than the sum of the parts look like when you have all those incredible assets? That's your job. So it's sort of like, okay, this is going to be fun. And I know most of the players in most of those parts. So not that it's going to be easy.
Yeah, with all the years you spent on campus, exactly, you can navigate your way in, out, and through, which is fantastic. And there's a lot that you have to do in this role that's influence as well, right? Especially at Berkeley. We don't like to be managed very much, do we, as faculty and researchers?
Yes, and just a silly story, but a fun one. I was looking at a student presentation this morning about the ecosystem, and there were these concentric circles. And the core circle was stuff that's, that you control directly. And then there's stuff that you control a little less directly. And I thought, I don't know if there's anything I control directly. I mean, it's sort of like the whole job description is influenced beyond formal authority. That's just the way it has to be at Berkeley.
Right. Well, there are a few areas that you do have some
Yes, I do. I'm overstating it a bit.
No. So let's talk about those, and then let's go through these concentric circles just kind of quickly because people can follow up. Things like our Skydeck.
Yes.
Accelerator and the licensing programs, and then share with you just some quick tidbits of kind of what this ecosystem looks like at Cal.
Yeah, well, so Skydeck is the main accelerator. There are multiple accelerators on campus, but the one that sort of
we have more than a dozen, don't we?
There's a blockchain accelerator. There's, really specific accelerators all over the campus, and then the Skydeck essentially consolidates them. It's like the top level brass ring accelerator and the most competitive to get into. So they bring in a group of roughly 25 companies, new companies, startups every 6 months. And the last round, there were 1,600 companies that applied. So it's quite competitive. So the head of Skydeck, Caroline Winnett, is a direct report of mine. So that's a direct, responsibility of mine in that sense. And then the licensing operation, which on Berkeley we call IPRA, but the IP stands for intellectual property, and the IRA is industrial research alliances. We got a lot of research alliances with mostly with larger companies. And the woman who runs that, Carol Mamura, is a direct report of mine as well. So those are sort of the formal verticals that come directly into my role.
And
And
then,
then you also asked about kind of the ecosystem
yeah.
generally. It's sort of like, how do you think? It's like, it is just such an organic and vital and rapidly moving thing that we're still kind of thinking a little bit about it. I mean, how, here's one piece of it where I feel like with all the strength, I think one of the things that we need to build out more is what's that first step that people take into entrepreneurship, right? So there are a lot of people on this campus that either don't see themselves as entrepreneurs, and it's like I can't take an entrepreneurship class, but I'm kind of interested. It's sort of
Right.
like, Skydeck is like, if you're at Skydeck and you're one of those teams, you're in the funnel, you're way down the funnel.
No,
You
by
built
then,
a
yeah,
team
people
and an
say, when
idea.
should I go to Skydeck? I have an idea. I go, no,
It-
no, you need to have a team. You need to have
It's
executed. You need to have customers. You
exactly.
got to do all of that. I advise some of those teams, and it's like by the time they get there, they've already shed their skin 3 or 4 times, and they're a higher caliber life form than I have an idea.
Yep, exactly.
So,
And we want sort of everybody, if possible, to feel like, hey, maybe entrepreneurship's the right thing for me, and to at least run some experiments. That's kind of in an ideal world.
so I'm going to use that term as the stepping off experiments. So there's two key types of experiments. Well, there's many, but two that we can talk about here. One are the kinds of scientific experiments that so many of our researchers run to create new knowledge breakthroughs, in all sorts of disciplines. And the other are the experiments that they might run to say, is this discovery of mine something that I can create a business opportunity or a social venture out of? So when you look at that kind of that research and that experimentation, where does that, I mean, is it let 1,000 flowers bloom? It happens everywhere in our classrooms, in our labs, in the research labs. Where do you see that, and how do you kind of scan the horizon for those things? You mentioned CRISPR as an example.
Yeah, well, the first of your two categories, I think you gotta let researchers do what they're passionate about, right? So when you're talking about sort of upstream or what we call basic research, or kind of early fundamental research, there's nothing like a person that is unleashed on the thing that they most like to think about, right? And when you start trying to channel that, I think you start to reduce the intellectual creativity of this remarkable university. So I think that really is a relatively unconstrained thing, rightfully. Then, though, these breakthroughs start to kind of move down the chain, and they get viewed by students and others, and it's like, wait a minute, there's some implications for how we all live
Right.
in that idea or set of ideas. And then the second category of experimentation, as you described it, kicks in. It's sort of like, is there a market for this? Would you pay for this? I need to actually interview some people and find out, would this fulfill a need that you have? And so that downstream experimentation and kind of development, sometimes people talk about research upstream and development downstream. I think of your latter category as kind of the on the ground development part of what the university does.
Yeah, so fascinating. Just kind of a quick commentary. For me, when I teach, I say to the entrepreneurs in the group, focus on the problem, not the solution. Right, but what's fascinating about researchers, yes, they're focused on the problem, but they're experimenting all the time with different types of solutions. They're putting hypotheses out there to see what works. So we have to flip those models around a little bit to be able, it's not just a bridge from science to business, it's also a bridge from solution to problem or vice versa. It requires different types of thinking, which is why I love teaching at UC Berkeley, because we have scientists and researchers and engineers, and we have creative business people, and we get to bring them together.
Well, I love that. Just to use one example that's smack dab on what you just described, one of the campus programs, Clean Tech to Market,
Right.
the idea is you send these graduate students, PhD students, and MBAs up to Lawrence Berkeley Lab, for example, to do commercialization analysis on some of the streams of the research.
Yep.
And then you talk to the upstream, hardcore researchers, and they say, this was so fun. I mean, I had no idea, I don't do that kind of thinking. What are the implications downstream? And it's really helpful for me to understand how people that are using this stuff think about it. And so it does start to affect the thinking of the upstream researchers.
So all of this at Berkeley, research, knowledge creation, startups with our incubators, accelerators, the classes and programs that my colleagues and I teach, this is all the petri dish stuff, the early stuff, right? But then we're inside the massive petri dish of Silicon Valley. So how does our proximity to Silicon Valley, where the billions of dollars of value get created, get invested, where we've got all of that much broader ecosystem, how does that tie in? How does our spot inside that massive petri dish help us and maybe have other impacts too?
Wow, there's so many, as you know well, there's so many elements of that connectivity, right? It's a many dimensioned thing. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind for a lot of people is financing, right? It's like, it's just not hard to get in front of a venture capitalist when you're in this, environment. But it goes so far beyond that, right? It's not just that VC is concentrated here. It is also things like advisors, right? So Skydeck, if somebody said, what's Skydeck, the big accelerators, what on campus, what's its most important asset? I'd say it's the 300 or so advisors that are, a lot of them from Silicon Valley, that have each of them started 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 companies in the area that you are trying to build a company in, and they are ready to take your call. They are not just on some list. It's like, oh, you're an advisor to Skydeck. No, it's sort of like, if you're an advisor to Skydeck, here's the job description. You actually have to be present and do some work. And so having that network of people that have done like what you're trying to do or something close to it, I mean, how valuable is that? So that's just one example that most people don't think of, but that stuff is very much present.
No, you're right. The network is not just there, but it has been activated. I mean, the Skydeck advisors know that every week they need to jump on a call with the companies that they're advising.
Yeah, that activated concept is really important.
Yeah. So I'm going to kind of wind down, and then I have one other topic I'd like to address. Okay. As a public university, what are the broader implications or responsibilities that we have to not just create all of this great knowledge and then give it back? Of course, there are elements of public funding, although less and less that we get. But also, is there an element of responsibility back to society that we have entrepreneurially and from an innovation standpoint?
Undoubtedly, in my mind, fundamentally in my mind. I mean, another way to say it is a lot of faculty and staff and students wouldn't be at Berkeley if it weren't public. Its publicness means something. So what does that mean? If somebody asked me, what problem is Berkeley trying to solve? Notice I didn't mention anything about entrepreneurship and innovation in that question. This is like the big question. And I think a sensible answer would be Berkeley is trying to take this enormous intellectual creativity, both in its research and its teaching, and map that, transform that into as much societal benefit as possible. So there are a lot of people who think about the world very differently than I do, right? like not through the lens of innovation and entrepreneurship, that can listen to that problem statement and say, yep, I can agree with that. Now, we might differ pretty quickly on tactics on how to do that. But if that's what the problem we're trying to solve, then this innovation and entrepreneurship ecosystem is a really important part of how that transformation from intellectual creativity to societal benefit happens. And, because Berkeley is a public institution, I mean, that's an even easier way to describe what Berkeley's trying to do than lots of other institutions.
So let me just tug on that one a little bit more. In addition to entrepreneurship, the for-profit entrepreneurship, whatever, I teach social ventures and social entrepreneurship.
Yep.
And we take a lot of these same principles around understanding problems, thinking about them differently, using design thinking to come up with nonlinear solutions, putting in place our own entrepreneurial or social ventures ecosystems to tackle really difficult challenges. So when we talk about your role or what you've seen on campus, do you have any thoughts for the social entrepreneurs among us? How to engage, recommendations, even resources that your office might be able to help kind of migrate in those directions?
Well, and there's a lot going on campus. I mean, even for example, Big Ideas, which has always had that as its center of gravity, and the scale that the Big Ideas programming has reached on the
Share a
Berkeley
little bit
campus.
more about that, if you would.
Yeah, so Big Ideas is effectively kind of very early stage. Let's get some ideas, most of them social entrepreneurship type ideas. Let's build some teams around those ideas. Let's give people, for many of these people, their first experience on building a team and thinking about an entrepreneurial business plan and what does customer discovery look like. So again, it's sort of like customer discovery. I thought we were talking about social entrepreneurship. It's sort of like, no, somebody needs to buy your idea, not
Right.
necessarily with money. Somebody needs to say, like a government, a policymaker is like, I'm going to do that. We're going to actually do that. So by buy, I'm not just talking about money. And so you need to fulfill a need in social entrepreneurship the same way you do in the private sector.
That
And
is so, no, that's so true. I've used the word customers
yep,
instead of beneficiaries, and people have a reaction. No, 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 they're not customers. It's like,
yep.
yes, because they actually need to sign up for whatever it is you are offering or doing.
Totally agree.
And the one other word that I try and drive into this is sustainability. And that's
Yep.
financial sustain, not just environmental or education or, housing, but it's, can you create a social venture that's economically sustainable? And if you can do that, then you don't have to go back for public funding.
Yep. I love it. And so, somebody, you've heard this metaphor, you probably used it a million times, but this idea of running downhill, right? It's like if you can create enough economic impetus in what you're doing,
Exactly.
and you have this larger purpose, the second or third bottom line, right? It's like, oh my gosh, now you're not trying to run uphill. You've got this downhill momentum.
Rich, we could keep going. You can tell
Yes,
how enthusiastic I am around this topic, and your
me too.
enthusiasm is palpable. But we won't
Okay.
for the benefit of all of us, I guess. I'm going to include a couple of URLs at the very end of this video, and I want to know if there's anything else that you would like me to include. I'll talk about Begin at Berkeley. And I'll
Yep.
also include a reference to Big Ideas.
Great.
Is there anything else that you would want me to include for people just wanting to know a little bit more about innovation and entrepreneurship at Berkeley, or are those two good places to start?
Well, two other quick ones is so IPIRA at Berkeley, IPIRA. That's for if you're a scientist and you want to, what does a licensing agreement look
Yep.
like, or how, that whole intellectual property management part. So that's a little bit more STEM focused, but for a lot of people, there's a lot of content on that website. And then another, and one could use a lot of examples, but there's a Berkeley Impact Ventures program, right? And the idea is it's basically a venture funding program. That one comes out of the Haas School, but if it's
Right.
sort of like impact venture funding, where do I find it? Impact Ventures, BIVP, I think is their acronym. That would be another one to have a look at.
Great. I'm going to put all those URLs up in about 15 or 30 seconds from now. So when we go to black, they'll be there for everybody to take a look at. Rich, thank you so much for joining us, for joining
Happy
me
to
and
help.
having such a great conversation.
Thank you, Mark.